Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery for another Sangha panel discussion. This evening we have with us a special guest, so Aya Nyanika, who's staying here at Empty Cloud for just a few days, so leaving in another day or two.
Saturday morning, yeah.
Yeah, day after tomorrow, so very soon. So we're happy to have her with us for just a few days. We'll make the most of this brief time. And we have a topic this evening, which I and Yannicka had recommended, which is to talk about volition and intention, or intention and volition. So before we start on this topic, we can begin by paying homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. And maybe Aya, since this was your topic suggestion, if you'd like to get us started with saying a few words on the subject, and then I'll say a few words and we'll take it from there.
All right, my words will be brief, Bhante. I was saying to Bhante beforehand that I'm not yet a Dhamma teacher. I'm still really studying the suttas. I'm still really applying them in practice. I'm still at the stage of exploring what does it mean to work with this. So looking at intention and volition, the what is it that prepares us toward action is an ongoing exploration. And I look through the suttas to give advice how to do that exploration. And then I sit with it. And some of the things that I've been noticing are the difference between inclining the mind toward and having that little movement before the action actually happens. And I think that would be the difference between the intention that we talk about is right intention, Sankara, and Chaitana, the volitional aspect of what is the movement. And I often will do this by like the exploration of the body. And I know you're not big in the commentaries, but there is one that really touched me. So I'll bring it up and then you can chat back with that. So the one that touched me was Bhikkhu Bodhi translated it. It was for the long discourse, number 2, gradual training. And in the commentary, it talks about how the teacher extended his arm and then brought it back and then extended his arm again. And the student said, well, why did you do that? And he said, because it wasn't with that clear comprehension, sati sampajana, that he didn't, the action was taken, but it wasn't with that clarity. And it just really, really struck me. And so as I explored, like, what is that difference with knowing and acting with? An exercise that I found from somatics was, and people can try it, is that to raise the arm up, I don't know if you can see it, but to the side and then lower it. Raise it halfway up and lower it. Raise it half of that and lower half. And just keep doing that motion until you really can't visibly see that the motion is happening, but you're still moving up and down and up and down. And then with that sense of what it means to move, just think that arm moving up to shoulder height. And then to make the movement with that thinking. And if you try this, you can really, I feel the difference between just moving and moving with intention. And this is like a really mundane example. But when it starts to really matter is when we're doing it with right intention. And that the motivations behind it, the preparations are there so that the action is something that is really aligned. You're very aware of what you're doing, and it's a wholesome activity. So that's kind of where I'm taking from the direction of the suttas and then trying to see what does it actually feel like right here.
Yeah, I mean, well, what comes to mind to me? First off, when you had first suggested this topic, I was thinking in terms of, Samma Sankappa, was we'd spoken about briefly, but also where the Buddha speaks about cetana, so volition, as being the basis of kamma.
Yes.
As the basis of what makes the kamma of an action is the underlying cetana. And what you were talking about just now was, to me, what was coming to mind was how much of what we do we're doing without really paying much attention. Like we're kind of just running on autopilot. But the thing is that autopilot is not karmically neutral.
Right.
Autopilot is still karmically potent, because on some level we're still doing what we're doing. It's just that we're not paying much attention to what we're doing, and we're not paying much attention to why we're doing it. So we think that, well, I'm just going on my habits, I'm going on my conditioning, but that's still a choice. It's a choice to act out our habits and conditioning. And it can seem like the easy route, because it's what we're used to doing. And on some level, it can actually feel automatic. But the reason it feels automatic is because we're not paying much attention to our own mind. So it's never actually automatic. It's something that we're doing. And it's through cultivating this sharp, clear self-awareness that we can start to realize exactly what it is we are doing, moment after moment. So actually, I like the exercise that you just described. I've never done it before, but I might try it out. Because, again, so often we're going through life in this kind of like mindless haze, where we're just like going through the motions and following our habits, acting out our autopilot. So without really paying attention to our underlying intentions behind what we're doing. But actually a big part of our practice is about, again, bringing intention into what we're doing, but specifically it's wholesome intention. Because it's also fine to be going on autopilot if your autopilot is completely in line with Dhamma. The problem is that the average person, their autopilot is not 100% in line with Dhamma. It's maybe partially, but not completely. So we can't trust our autopilot.
Well, a lot of time that autopilot is doing hindrances.
Yeah. Yeah, and also what comes to mind on a similar line is that one of the meanings of the word sila is habit. So practicing sila can also be understood as generating new habits, more wholesome habits.
Nice.
So normally we have habits which are not particularly wholesome. So the practice of sila is generating wholesome habits. So retraining the mind to have a wiser autopilot. But yeah, again, coming back to the issue of volition and intention. Again, when I hear this, I think of the word sankappa and the word cetana. So sankappa, the literal meaning is preparation. Like, how do you prepare your mind? And cetana actually comes from the same root as chitta. So it's actually, how are you thinking about what you're doing? Like, how are you directing the mind? And in terms of samma sankappa, the Buddha talks about the three kinds of samma sankappa. So the sankappa of nekamma, renunciation, the sankappa of avyapada, so non-aversion, not having any aversion or negativity, and avihingsa, so not having any wish for harm. So the harmlessness. So it's like preparing the mind by bringing up this genuine inclination towards letting go, towards contentment, towards harmlessness, towards absence of negativity or ill will. Yeah, and then similarly in terms of cetana, so the Buddha does directly equate cetana with karma. So the intention behind what we're doing is the most important component. And it's important to recognize there that also includes the intention to consider the consequences of our choices. Mm-hmm. So you can say, oh, well, I did it with good intentions. And it's like, well, yeah, but were you actually considering what effect your choices were going to have? So if we're acting negligently or carelessly, well, that's also intention, because we're intentionally acting with negligence. We're intentionally acting carelessly, or intentionally acting recklessly. Those are a few thoughts that come to mind. What's on your mind?
Well, I'm curious. I can describe kind of what preparation is for me in a bodily sense of moving into the world, or even sitting in meditation, or just kind of a few things that I do to align the mind, and then maybe I'll mention the hindrances and the factors of enlightenment. But I'd be curious what you employ, or if you know of other things, particularly from the suttas, of recommendations of what to employ. So one thing I do is like awareness of the body. What is its posture as I'm sitting, or as I'm standing, as I'm moving, and to soften, to give it a softness. I let the belly kind of hang. And for me, I notice a lot of my inclining in my tongue. And different people have different parts, but I pull my tongue backwards and it gets tight. And it is a body sensation that I know that I'm not in the state of right intention. I have it's a nice little spot that I can detect that I'm not all the way there. And so I'll soften the tongue. It's just a somatic way to help remind myself where I'm going. And then I open the heart, and it's kind of the physicality of it, but it's metta. It's metta. It's but it's kind of this, just to have this radiance, so that I'm steady, I'm balanced, I'm radiant as I meet these things. So that's my preparation. And then, particularly if I'm sitting, because that's the easiest time when you're kind of looking for it. If I'm sitting and a hindrance arises, I realize I'm doing this hindrance. I'm doing this hindrance, and I look. How am I? Where am I doing this hindrance? Not like it's a thought, but like it's a tension. It's a I want, I don't want, I'm spaced out. Find out where in each body that manifests. But I'm starting to get the vocabulary for me. Oh yeah, that's greed. Oh yeah, that's doubt. Oh yeah. And so the vocabulary of the hindrances. And because I'm in this kind of spacious, balanced space, it's like I'm not then going into a story about the hindrances. And then I can, consider what is the antidote. And what does it feel like to have, the mindfulness? What does it feel like to have the right energy, the tranquility, whatever it is that is the balancing factor for that? And then that is where the volitional aspect of meeting it comes in. It's like the choice. I am choosing not to stay with hindrance A. I'm picking, antidote Q, L, whatever, got to be a different part of the alphabet, delta, to work with on it. So I know it's, probably not directly in the suttas that way, but they do have the suttas about, with this, antidote that. And so that's, does that feel like I'm using it correctly, or?
Yeah, I mean, well, what I'm always interested in is results. So I'm actually not so,
awesome.
exactly. I'm actually not so interested in methodology as I am in results.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not really about what we're doing. It's about what effect it has.
Mm-hmm.
So if the results are good, if it results in a increase in wholesome states and a decrease in unwholesome states, then that's great. That's what's important. And to me, that actually comes down to a very basic fundamental intention, which is kind of underlying all Buddhist practice, whether during meditation or not, which is the intention to reduce unwholesome tendencies of mind and increase wholesome tendencies of mind. And so to me, that's kind of like coming back to that as our basic ground. So I think the summary of right effort, to me, right effort is itself a summation of Buddhist practice. So it's the effort to prevent unwholesome mind states from arising, or to eliminate them if they're present, to encourage wholesome mind states to arise, and to perfect them if they're present. So this, to me, this is kind of like what we're doing in Buddhism all the time, or well, optimally what we're doing all the time. And in terms of preparing the mind for meditation, I also found that was interesting how you're talking about noticing what you're doing with your tongue. Well, I mean, one thing that I've noticed is that to me, aversion often manifests in this tension around my eyes and especially around my eyebrows. So often I'll start with any meditation, I'll like bring attention to my forehead and eye region and just notice like what's going on here. Is there some tension there? Is there some tightness? And that's almost always an indication that there's a lot of aversion in the mind. And then like sometimes I actually just like deliberately massaging away any tension also then helps to kind of like smooth away the aversion in the mind, like soften up the mind a bit so that it can be a little more metaful instead of grumpy, dociful. And similarly, in terms of like what's going on during one's meditation, another thing which I found really useful on the topic of volition is when looking at mental objects that are present, or mental processes or thoughts or anything that's present, is first to check what's the volition content of this. Is this something which I'm actually actively doing right now? Or is it something which is just appearing in the mind of its own accord? Because this to me is a really big distinction. Like often we're getting bothered about a mental object, but it's not actually something that we're doing. It's just an echo of something from the past. So something that we've heard in the past or something that we've thought in the past, and it just kind of echoes into the present. But since we're not actually actively doing it, we don't need to be concerned. As long as we don't react to it or get involved in it, then eventually it will change and disappear, usually quite quickly. What we do need to be much more concerned about is what are we actively, intentionally doing with the mind? Because that's what's generating karma.
And you include the habit intention in that, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because so a habit doesn't actually mean you're going to do something. It means you have a strong tendency to do something. But there's still a decision being made to follow through with that tendency. This is why I said earlier that going by habit is not necessarily blameless. Because you're still choosing to follow your habits.
When you can feel it. I mean, I feel it a lot if I've got that and just using the hindrance, if I've got a grasping, and sometimes I will feel, I just call it like the little hands in the mind. Like there will be the sensation of the habit of grasping, but it's not directed at anything yet.
Mm.
And it will really want to find something to say, I want that, or I want that, or I want, but the discomfort. And so part of it for me is the investigation of what does this feel like? And then it's like that hot pan. It's a lot easier than to go, nope. But so I spent enough time just watching this sensation without letting it go to that next step of the contact with, the mental move to, well, what is it I want? And just being with the actual great discomfort of just wanting. And then that gives me much more of a sense to want to turn to enlightenment factors as what to bring in for the cultivation.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I'm seeing here there's a question. So Kumu says, is it correct to say we are producing kamma, action as inaction is also a form of action? That's true. Deciding to not do something is also a decision and therefore is kamma. So is it correct to say we are producing kamma all the time other than when we are asleep? We are producing kamma whenever we intentionally make a decision. Whenever we make any decision, and actually we make a decision every single moment. So even if as you're saying, even if the decision is to not do anything, that's still a decision and therefore has karmic weight. So as far as I can tell, actually, yes, we are making kamma basically every single waking moment. We're making kamma, whether it's the kamma of a particular action or the kamma of choosing inaction. What are your thoughts on this?
Oh, I would definitely agree with that. It's not doing something is a choice.
Yeah.
Doing something is a choice. Not doing is a doing. And so I don't see a difference. Although we don't. I notice that if I want to stop doing something, I can't just not do that. I have to do something else. So there's two. I don't think that's the question. I think the question is inactivity. But if I'm already down a track and I'm doing something, even if it's just the arm is lifted, not to not have the arm lifted, I have to do the put the arm down. And it's the same, I think, with the hindrances. If I just let them be there, or any kilesa, if I just let it be there, it might run its course or something. Something else will eventually get into the channels. But it's far more wholesome for me, like you say, with right effort, to do something else.
Yeah, and it's worth noting in the Vitakkasanthana Sutta that that's the first recommendation the Buddha makes. The first recommendation he makes is to deliberately turn the mind towards something wholesome. Whereas the recommendation of just like inattention or not directing the mind to the unwholesome thing, that's afterwards. And like slowing down the production of thought, that's afterwards. So he actually starts with turning the mind to something wholesome. And then next is considering the drawbacks of the unwholesome thought or activity. So, and it's only if those two aren't working that then he recommends not paying attention to the unwholesome thought. And if that's also not working, then he recommends at least try to like slow it down or reduce it a bit. So it's this kind of like trying out different things. And actually as far as I can tell, the most direct and potent method actually is to just stop. But that's the third recommendation the Buddha makes. And I think it's because it is very difficult to actually just stop. Like when we're in an unwholesome track, it's difficult to just stop on a dime. It's easier to be like, okay, let's change direction. Let's turn the mind towards the wholesome, rather than just saying like, okay, we're just going to come to a dead stop right now. Or at least to point out to yourself like, okay, yeah, I'm thinking some pretty aversive thoughts. this is really unwholesome. It's generating discomfort for myself. It creates a tendency towards unwholesome action and so on. So reflecting on the drawbacks. Again, it's the mind is in a doing mode. So let's at least turn the doing towards something more useful, more wholesome. But it is worth noting he does give this, one of his recommendations is basically just stop. Just don't do that.
I'm going to have to look at that more. Thank you.
Yeah. But yeah, again, coming back to this, it's as far as the whole action versus inaction, I think it's also really worth pointing out that the Buddha said there's two kinds of good karma. So doing what should be done and not doing what should not be done. And similarly, two kinds of bad karma. So doing what should not be done and not doing what should be done. So of these four kinds of karma, two of them are about non-doing. So again, the Buddha was quite clear. I don't know where this idea that inaction is not karma came from, because the Buddha quite clearly stated that inaction is also karma. It's also a decision. So it's kind of this common, I hear this come up every now and then, of like the arhat who just impassively watches as a passerby drowns. That's not Buddhism. Just to be clear, as far as I can tell, that's also karma. So if you have the ability to help another sentient being and you just stand there and watch as they suffer, then you're making bad karma in that moment.
I have a hard time even wrapping my brain around how, because when the heart is open and free, how action wouldn't flow naturally towards the compassionate, wise path. It feels like a thought experiment that doesn't land here in the limited ways that I've noted, toward freedom. It's just like I can't see that as a thought experiment that would be an actuality within a freed being.
Yeah, I agree. And see, so Karen says, thanks for the tongue example. I just noticed that there's tension in my tongue, and I'm curious to see if it correlates with a hindrance. Do you have anything to add on that?
Well, I mean, you don't even need to go so to the gross level of what we tend to think of as hindrance. It's like a habit response, that we've conditioned this habit response. And then if you keep backing up, you'll see whether there's an aversion there or there's a, something else behind it. But you don't actually need to track it all the way back to the hindrance. If it is feeling tight, my experience thus far is when I'm tightening, I'm not open and compassionate and wise. I'm constricted. And so for me, this was, it was also, in the pelvis and the lower belly was another area that I worked on earlier, but then I just noticed this in the tongue is my latest, like, oh yeah, there too. Or like you mentioned the forehead, other people have mentioned the jaw. The jaw is a common one. So, or, whether the posture's like, more this or, yeah. So you can kind of see whether it's very sloppy or very tight. And then you could back your way up to the hindrance, but I don't think you actually need to, like the Buddha doesn't necessarily say, track it back. If you already have a sense that this isn't helpful, you don't need to do all of that mental chatter. If at that point you can just say, what if I soften it? So try just, if you notice the tongue is tight or whatever, try softening it and see if your meditation is different, or see if your conversation is different, or see if whatever the activity you're doing is different. And the results have been good so far from this exploration.
Great. Yeah. And Jay Lyle says, what are the karmic implications of one having the intention to be blind to the results of one's actions so as to avoid facing the knowledge that one is doing harm intentionally? Yeah, that would be, again, an example of bad karma. So the intention to be blind to the results of one's actions is, again, it's the karma of negligence, the karma of pamada. So this negligence or recklessness or carelessness. And it is bad karma, and it does produce harmful consequences. One of the most immediate harmful consequences it produces, by the way, is that this is the antithesis of mindfulness. So you'll be weakening one of the factors of awakening. So you'll be cultivating a negligence, a lack of awareness of your own mind and your own actions. And also, since you'll be harming other sentient beings, then the result is that you yourself will be the recipient of misfortune. You'll find yourself having bad luck, whether in this life or in future lives. And even worse, since you're deliberately cultivating ignorance, then you'll also be experiencing an increase in delusion and confusion. So actually, to be deliberately blind to the results of your own actions, this is very, very harmful karma. This is not something to do. In my opinion, it's actually much better to deliberately do bad things, but with full awareness that you're doing bad things.
I'd agree.
And paying full attention to the consequences of those choices.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds dreadful, and I think it's spot on.
Yeah, at least then you're developing wisdom.
Right.
Which will lead in the future to the reduction in bad choices.
Yeah, yeah. I had a teacher once who said that a student was sent to him that was violent on the streets. It was a youth, and he was violent on the streets. And so he said, okay, well, what is it you like to do? Well, I like to throw people down and kick them. And so he said, okay, show me your kick. And he says, oh, you call that a kick? I can teach you to kick harder than that. And what he didn't tell him, and so then he walked him through, okay, you've got a whole bunch of anger as you're doing this kick. You're not so powerful. What if you kind of soften up? What if you kind of bring this love into your heart? Just try it. Now try your kick. Wow, it's so much more powerful. What he didn't tell the kid was, as he cultivated these other states, he wasn't going to want to do the kicking anymore.
Interesting.
So it's like, can you explore doing the same? If you're going to do something evil, you might as well do it with as much force as you can, and you're going to find that comes actually with love.
Interesting.
And love is so much more powerful than anger, because anger is constricting. At least that's been my experience. Hate is constricting.
I hadn't thought of it in that way. Yeah, I think the really important thing here, though, is that we're constantly paying attention to our states of mind. We're constantly paying attention to our actions. We're constantly noticing what's happening. And then we start to make the connections. We start to recognize that unwholesome choices produce unpleasant states of mind and unpleasant consequences. So that then in the future, we'll tend to avoid those kinds of behaviors. So it's, I mean, if we're going to do bad things, then we should pay full attention to it. And we should be actually fully honest with ourselves that that's what we're doing, that we're fueling unwholesome states of mind, and that it's generating harmful consequences. And then in the future, then we'll tend to be more restrained.
And if we're meditation practitioners, notice if you've done something unwholesome, whether you were like planning on it or not, or fully mindful of it or not, notice how it impacts your meditation. For me, I have like done something, even if it wasn't like with a conscious choicefulness. I've done something, I go to sit, and it's like, it's when restlessness comes up in my sit, like, no, because it's lodged here. And that's when I want to make a different choice. And that's where the volition then comes in next time. It's like, oh yeah, I remember the impact of that.
Yeah. Okay, and we have another question here. So Sam says, for Nikama, what are we renouncing? Is it materialism, sensuality, or... Well, I mean, properly speaking, we're renouncing everything. But if we want to be a little more precise, we can say we're renouncing self-identity, because that's the root of all suffering. We can say we're renouncing ignorance or delusion, because again, that's the root of all suffering. We can say we're renouncing desire and attachment, because again, that's the root of all suffering. So you can more generally speaking say we're renouncing unwholesome states of mind. But in general, what we're talking about in renunciation is the cultivating the mind of contentment, the mind of non-attachment, the mind of non-desire, the mind which is perfectly fine with not having anything at all. So this is actually the basis of happiness is contentment. It's being happy without needing anything at all. So that's usually what I think of when I think of nekama. I think of contentment, contentment with little, contentment with even nothing at all. What are your thoughts?
I would echo that. Fewness of wishes. Yeah, the being with what is, not trying to overlay. It's also like how I'm looking at reality, renouncing me getting involved in there and having ideas about it. And if I do have ideas, to see how conditioned they are and what momentum is it leading to, and being as choiceful as I can. It's not that we don't think to function in the world, but maybe I try not to overthink so much, which is my tendency. Others may have different tendencies.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to relate to thinking as a powerful tool.
Yeah.
Which is very useful in some situations and useless or even counterproductive in other situations. Yeah, and for many people, the problem is that they have their thinking tool running constantly, whether it's needed or not, whether it's helpful or harmful. I sometimes think of the thinking mind as being like a chainsaw. Chainsaw is very useful under certain situations, but if you just walk around all day with a running chainsaw in your hands, yeah, one, it's annoying, and two, it's dangerous.
I love that one. Yeah.
And next, so Chandrasekhar says, does our karma stimulate others' karma? Don't quite know what they're asking here.
Are you asking, are you responsible for someone else's action?
Yeah, I mean, if you can give Chandrasekhar, if you could give a bit more explanation about what you mean by your question, then we can give some answer here. And briefly speaking, everybody is responsible for their own choices. So you can't blame somebody else for your decisions. But at the same time, we do need to consider what choices we make, because our choices do affect others and influence others. So just an example of this, I have a friend who lives in Germany. And one day he was crossing the street when there was a don't walk sign. And of course in Germany, they're big on following the rules. And so there was a man there with his son. And the father he started yelling at my friend, like right in the street, like, what are you doing? Like, how dare you? Like, not only you're breaking the rules, but you're doing it in front of a child. Like, now you're teaching my son that it's okay to break rules. Like, what's wrong with you? Like, how dare you do this? And what struck me about this was like, it was this sense of like, not only are you breaking the rules, but you're teaching other people that it's okay to break rules. Yeah. And I'm not saying that like the rule don't cross at the don't walk sign is inherently a good rule or a bad rule.
Right.
I've sometimes been known to cross when it said don't walk. And actually, if you go to New York City, it's almost like the walk, don't walk signs are optional. Nobody really pays much attention. They're more looking to see if there's any cars coming their way. And even that sometimes doesn't stop them. But more, it's more this idea of like we actually do need to consider how the behaviors we display influence other people. And this becomes even stronger as a monastic. So like as a monastic, people expect us to act in line with Dhamma. And they will take what we do as an example of appropriate conduct.
That was immediately what came up in my mind was the sight of the samana. And I've had people come up and just say that the presence, the action, the way that I was moving, the whatever, was bringing them something. Now, I'm not saying that a lot of that might not have been projection, but they were projecting because of what touched them. And if I had been behaving, for example, I was talking with a man at a train station, and after a while, he wanted to give me money, and I said, no, I don't use money. And he says, "You're the real deal." And then he's like, "Can I actually talk to you?" You know, it's like that opened something for him. So my action did have an impact. I'm not responsible for the way he responded, though. However, I definitely have to consider, how do I hold this rule will impact the perception of someone else.
Yeah.
Sanya, samana. Samana, sanya, samana, sanya.
Samana, sanya.
Yeah.
So let's see. And Kumu has a question. On a daily mundane basis, most of our actions must be having neutral effects or very slightly positive or negative effects. Not much karmic force unless they are truly unwholesome or wholesome. True? What are your thoughts on this?
I wouldn't want to bet on it. I don't know. I honestly don't know, but I wouldn't want to bet on it. Why not cultivate wholesome? You know?
Yeah, I would say don't sell yourself short. I would say treat every moment as though it's important. And in every moment, try to make choices which are, at least slightly wholesome, at least slightly positive. Because that also builds up over time. So it's the old simile of drop by drop, the bucket is filled. So similarly, make sure that you're putting in positive drops. Anything else on that?
No.
Okay. And Rainbow says, Buddhism teaches that too much thinking about certain topics can be harmful, which is true. But isn't it necessary to learn more about the world so that we don't cause harm through willful ignorance? I mean, I would say, once again, it's important to have some reflection on the consequences of one's choices. And with that knowledge, then it becomes a bit easier to make wholesome decisions. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on this question?
Cause harm through willful ignorance. Oh, I mean, what comes to mind is not acknowledging racism. You know, just because you don't have to. I think if you are this kind of gets back to that willful turning away. I don't think you have to go get an education in all of race theory and all of that in order to, look at the history of the world and racial conflict. However, looking at privilege, looking at what ease I move through the world with versus what ease someone who's a person of color might move through that same exact neighborhood. And I've had this exact experience where my experience in a hallway in a building was vastly different than the experience of a person of color in that hallway in the building. And so coming into the awareness of these systemic issues does help me to make choices that are more wholesome for myself as well as for others in society. But it doesn't mean that I have to go attend all the courses. And if that's forward leading for an individual, wonderful. But when there's it's like, don't turn away from it.
I think it's strongly shaped by what segment of the world that we're occupying.
Yes.
So, for example, if you go to live in Armenia, then you should make some effort to understand the situation in Armenia.
Yes.
But if you're not living in Armenia, it's not really that important for you. Like, it's not something which is directly relevant.
I don't watch the news.
Yeah. So this is where I think, like, learning about the world, it can just turn into a tremendous time trap.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, like,
Yeah.
I have this general vague awareness that some really awful things happened in Armenia a few years ago, but nothing against Armenia. It's just a random example that popped into my mind.
Yeah.
But because it doesn't directly affect my daily life, I haven't put effort into learning much about it. But if I actually went to live in Armenia, then I would make an effort to learn a little bit so that I could relate to people in a way which was informed and not terribly insensitive.
Yeah.
So yeah, again, I think it's strongly shaped by one's conditions. But so learning a little bit so that you're able to interact with the people that you interact with in the most skillful and appropriate way, I think that's good. But also recognizing when we just turn it into an excuse to spend a couple hours on Google.
Yeah.
It's like, or following the endless Wikipedia rabbit holes. You can while away hours and hours and hours just chasing worldly information, which ultimately isn't going to bring you one step closer to awakening.
And it's a balancing of the compassion and wisdom.
Yeah.
It's the amount of information I take in is not the actual basis for that balancing. It's much more of a movement of the heart. It's much more of a when I act like this, it moves me toward or away from. So I wouldn't collect information for information's sake.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other thing I would say is that the mental and emotional skills that we develop through Buddhist practice they're very much Swiss Army knife skills. Like you develop things like metta and mindfulness and equanimity and generosity and patience and such, and they're pretty much universally applicable skills that will get you through pretty much any conceivable situation.
Yeah.
So it's most of the time it's not really that necessary to develop a deep or extensive body of worldly knowledge. So it's actually much more important to cultivate these wholesome traits of mind that will make it easier for you to adapt to whatever situations you find yourself in. And it's also actually perfectly fine to say things like, I'm not an expert on these topics. I haven't spent the time studying them in depth, but I'm willing to if it's necessary and if it's helpful. And actually being honest about that. Like if you actually are in a situation where you're like, okay, I actually really do need to learn a bit more about this particular aspect of culture or history or whatever, in order to be able to be compassionate towards people, then do so. Follow up on that willingness. Okay. And Sud asks, do devas help those with good intentions? Did the Buddha ever say anything about that? What do you think?
I can't respond necessarily from the suttas, but the devas in the suttas do rejoice in the qualities of the mind. And do they help those with good intentions?
I mean, generally speaking, what we find in the suttas is that the devas do, at least some of the devas are on the side of Buddhist practitioners and will help them out to one degree or another. But it's not a universal thing. Like there are some devas which are pro-Buddhism and other devas which are pro-sensuality and other devas which are a little on the grumpy side. like asuras. Asuras are technically a category of deva, which are grumpy devas. There's a sutta in the Sangha Nikaya, the fault-finding devas, the complaining devas who come to the Buddha and start complaining about actually the teaching of anatta.
Oh,
yeah.
I'm not familiar with that one.
Well, they came to the Buddha and they said, like, they're like, you're a hypocrite. And the Buddha's like, excuse me? I'm paraphrasing a little bit.
Yeah.
And the devas are like, because you teach about not self, but then you're all saying things like, well, I am going over there by myself. And they're like, you hypocrite. And then the Buddha says, well, that's just a way of communicating, because otherwise it's really inconvenient. This set of 5 khandas is sitting next to that set of 5 khandas, talking to that other set of 5 khandas. Really awkward communication. So that was the fault-finding devas.
Well, and there are devas that are not so, that they're, there's the deva that intentionally tried to break up the 2 monastics who were getting along quite well, to make a scandal. And so one doubted the other. So I think there are devas that rejoice in good intentions and, might help that along. Well, there's the devas that always made sure a particular monk had food. So just like the rest of the world systems.
Yeah, devas are just like people. There's good people and there's bad people. So it's the same. There's good devas and there's bad devas. And even Mara is a deva. He's just a particularly troublesome, unhelpful, counterproductive deva. But he's still a deva. So it's all over the map. There are devas who help people with good intentions, but there's certainly devas who don't, or are even outright harmful. And let's see. By the way, there's a number of questions which are off topic. So I've been skipping the off topic questions. You can bring those to Monk Chat tomorrow evening. So Monk Chat is our chance for all the random off topic questions. So if I'm skipping your question, don't take it personally. Just bring it to Monk Chat tomorrow. And Manal says, in terms of unwholesome thoughts, how intentional is it to simply observe them, recognizing these as something that has arisen in the mind and not necessarily applying right effort? What do you think about this?
Oh, I guess I'd start with the one about the guard who, mindfully watches the thief come in and mindfully watches the thief go out.
I think I would fire that guard.
Yeah.
I'd be like, okay, you got part of your job correct.
Right. So, my personal experience with this has been that if I know it's something that's mildly harmful, I'm not, breaking a huge precept or something, it's something mildly harmful, and I have a habit of doing it. So I personally have found it useful to continue that activity with as much mindfulness as I can bring to bear. I did this, I have a history of food addiction. And so I did this is before I was maybe just coming to Buddhism. And I had the habit of buying at my groceries a family-sized bag of spicy Doritos. And most of the groceries would go in the back of the car. That would come up into the driver's seat with me. And I would eat it on the way back to my apartment. And it would be gone in that 20-minute drive. This is food addiction. This is addiction. And I would get back to the apartment. My mouth would be sore. It would be all burnt from that spiciness. I would feel so sick. So I knew the ramifications of this behavior, and yet I seemed to keep repeating it. So one day, and I don't know what it was that I was starting with mindfulness. One day I got to the car, I came to the front, I had the key, I had the bag of Doritos, and I said, and there's always the intention of not eating it all on the way home. So that's what I thought my intention was. In reality, that bag was gone week after week. So I put the keys down and I said, okay, I'm going to eat this bag mindfully. So I'm not doing a wholesome activity in the eating behavior. It's going to make me sick. And I sat there, and about 3 bites in, I was done. It had met that craving need, what it was that I was, it's like, oh, okay, this actually isn't that pleasant. It's not, and I wasn't into the scurry. I made myself continue to eat. I ate that whole bag in the parking lot, experiencing it with mindfulness, so that it wasn't like I was sick later after I was, past the delusional, just I'm driving and eating. I could feel the process of getting sick. I have never done that again.
That's brilliant.
Never done it. So here's an application where I did intentionally do something that was mildly harmful and definitely unskillful with mindfulness, because it made me see it very clearly. But in general, I wouldn't use that because is it real? Is it true? Are you actually mindful, or are you using it as an excuse?
Yeah. I mean, that's, again, as I mentioned earlier, if you're going to do something unwholesome anyway, then you might as well use it as an opportunity to develop wisdom. But the ideal thing is actually just not to do unwholesome things. But it's, again, sometimes it's like, well, I'm going to do this anyway, so I might as well bring the full force of wisdom to bear here. So actually, I love your example there, because, again, it's relatively mild. So overeating on junk food is, I mean, on the opposite extreme, we have like torturing small children to death.
Exactly.
So
right.
I think this is
be choiceful. Is it within the precepts to some extent?
Yeah. So if you're addicted to torturing children, then that one you should just stop doing entirely, like right away. But if you're addicted to overeating Doritos, then yeah, actually the whole like bringing complete mindfulness and wisdom to the experience, I think that's actually a very clever way of just really being honest with yourself about what you're doing to yourself. And as you say, the result was that you stopped the harmful behavior. So I would say in that case, the result makes it worth it.
Yeah. And honestly, if there's a bag of Doritos, in the line at a thing, I can take 3 Doritos. I don't, it doesn't lead to further, and I often I'll pass it up just completely just because I don't want it. But I have the capacity, like, oh, okay, this person's offered it. Yes, they can go in the bowl. And then I mix it up with the rest of it, and, it's just not that thing.
Great. I appreciate your honesty, by the way. It's always interesting to hear about pre-monk stories.
Yeah.
I hope that's a pre-monk story.
That was definitely a pre-monk story.
Okay.
Definitely.
So Dan has a question. I'm a little confused by the phrasing here, but maybe you'll get at this more clearly. It says, ignorance leads to Sankara. Saying that's a reference to Paticca Samuppada. Is the ignorance not knowing, in the words of Samyutta Nikaya 12.15, that's one of my favorite suttas in the entire Pali Canon, by the way. And we normally chant it every morning here at Empty Cloud Monastery. Kachana Gupta Sutta says, what's arising is just suffering arising, what's ceasing is just suffering ceasing. That's also one of my favorite quotes in the entire Pali Canon. So Dan, you're already on my good side. It says, so we make a choice, Sankara. Honestly, I do not translate Sankara as choice. I have, over the years, I've come across many, many different translations of the word Sankara, and they're pretty much all bad to one degree or another, but choice is phenomenally bad as a translation for Sankara. I tend to like Actually, my favorite tends to be construct. I quite like construct because it's actually extremely literal. Sankara. The prefix sang corresponds to the prefix kan, and kara or skara in Sanskrit corresponds to struct. So construct means to put something together. Sankara literally also means putting things together. It's from it actually has exactly the same meaning, putting things together. So construct, I like construct. Formation is also okay. Preparation, I'm not a huge fan.
Actually, construction is the one that I've gone to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Often I find Sankara. Yeah, Sankara also translates very well just with the English word thing. Like Sabe Sankara Anicca, all things are impermanent. That also works perfectly fine. But yeah, choice is a particularly limited and awkward way of translating the word Sankara. So I'm not a fan. But it is true that based upon ignorance, we make choices. And choices based upon ignorance often have unpleasant consequences. One of the things that we tend to do based on ignorance is we generate more dukkha for ourselves because we're generating more desire and more attachment, which then leads naturally to more dukkha.
Ignorance leads to construction. Works for me.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we construct our world, and our world is ultimately it's built up out of ignorance. And I could actually talk for ages just on the first two links of Paticca Samuppada, Avijja, Paccaya, Sankara. I could give a whole Dhamma talk just on those three words.
Really great Dhamma talk.
Yeah.
Maybe do that instead of monk chat tomorrow.
No, some other time. I actually really like monk chat. It's often my favorite Dhamma event of the week.
Yeah.
And you'll be there tomorrow.
Okay.
Okay, and I see a couple more off-topic questions. And Dan Jones says, that would be a great talk. Okay, one of these days. So Chandrasekhar says, just like Buddha's karma stimulates us to do good karma. I assume that's the previous question about, can our karma stimulate other people's karma? Well, one thing I would point out, by the way, is that the fact that we've encountered Buddhism is the result of our own good karma. So if we did not have some kind of karmic affinity with Buddhism, then we wouldn't have been born at a time and place where Buddhism was accessible, or we wouldn't have encountered it. Or if we did encounter it, we wouldn't have been interested. So actually it blows my mind. Every now and then I meet people who were born in Buddhist countries, raised in Buddhist families, in Buddhist cultures, and yet have zero interest in Buddhism. And I'm just like, wow. Yeah. I wish I had been born in those conditions. I probably would have become a monk at the age of 10.
Likewise.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was like looking for this before I knew what I was looking for.
Exactly. Same here. Like Bhante Sumita became a monk when he was like 12, I think. And he was like, he wanted to be a monk since he was 7 or something. It just took him a little while. So for him, a little while means from the age of 7 to 12. Yeah, I find that especially touching. Like he just always had access to the Dhamma. So very, very early on, he was like, oh, that's what I want to do with my life. Anyway, so technically it's our own good karma that we have access to the Buddha's teachings. So the Buddha was teaching the Dhamma as his own perfection of compassion. So that was the Buddha's own powerful compassion that he cultivated over hundreds of lifetimes. It manifested in him teaching Dhamma. So that's an aspect of nature. An aspect of nature is that every now and then somebody teaches Dhamma. Whether or not we come in contact with it depends upon the choices that we make in the course of our lives. At least that's how I usually think about these things.
There's a sutta in the eights that's talking about the 8 qualities of this particular layperson, Uga, I think.
Yes.
And the first of the good qualities was that when on his first sighting of the Buddha, his heart, were you there when we talked about this one? Yeah.
Mm.
Okay. That his heart leapt up.
Mm.
You know, and I did think, okay, this is the result of Uga's karma.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that sighting just, oh. And then, you know, he quickly becomes a stream enterer and, you know, goes on from there.
Mm-hmm.
But,
Delightful sutta, by the way.
oh, it's a fantastic sutta.
I actually just gave a sutta talk on that a couple of weeks ago on Ayasoma's recommendations. She also really likes that one.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, and again, I see a couple off-topic questions that we can go through tomorrow at Monk Chat. And Jay Lyles says, do one's actions always follow from one's intentions? For example, when certain people misrepresent the Dhamma, it is hard to imagine they are doing so intentionally, and yet they misrepresent. I would not be so certain when you say they are not doing so intentionally. I would say some people actually do intentionally misrepresent the Dhamma for their own purposes. So I'd say some people it actually is intentional. Other people, it's just their own delusion or their own lack of wisdom or their own lack of understanding.
Or a lack of memory, and they insert the wrong word in, and then somebody says, oh, no, it's actually that. And then they go, oh, you're right, thank you. You know?
Yeah, I mean, but it's also true that there actually is just a lot of inaccurate Dhamma teachings out there. And yeah, I would say often it's coming from misunderstanding, or actually very often it's coming from somebody's own deeply held opinions and views, which are not examined. Mm-hmm. So one of the important things in Buddhist practice is we need to have the willingness, the intention, to examine all of our views and the intention to relinquish any view which is not in line with Dhamma. Absolutely any view, no matter how tightly cherished that view is, we need to be willing to chuck it out. So, for example, one of my pre-Buddhist views that I was very, very fond of was the belief anything is possible. And then I started reading through the suttas, and I came across the Buddha talking about what's possible and what's impossible. And I was like, ouch, I actually have to relinquish one of my deeply cherished opinions.
Mm-hmm. Me too. Mine was that there really isn't evil. It's just a delusion that, you know, and if they really, and it is true, maybe if they really, really knew better, they would do. But yeah, I had a hard time thinking that people would actually intentionally do evil. And it was like shocking to finally come to the realization, no, there is intentional evil. It's not just delusion. Ouch.
Yeah. I think that
It's
also
reality.
shows that you're a very pure-hearted person.
Yeah, but it's it's alignment with reality is the Dhamma. And if you aren't willing to give up that thing that because it felt good to think that, you know, it just kind of, it was a little la landy, but it just kind of, you know, but it was a la pleasant, which is different than the pleasant of the reality is.
What I would say is I would say that everyone has the potential to be a good person or the capacity to be a good person. Yeah. And if we wanted to be really precise about this, there's actually ways of speaking where you could say that all evil actions come from delusion. Yes. Because if one had perfect wisdom, then one would, well, be a Buddha. Yeah. So then naturally a Buddha doesn't do anything evil. Yeah. But yeah, I would say in a more ordinary sense, then yeah, of course there's evil. And of course there's people who will intentionally harm others. Yeah.
So I'm not just going to be able to love them and talk sense into them. Necessarily.
Probably not. Sometimes the right thing to do is to stay far away.
Exactly.
Actually, in the Sabasava Sutta, the Buddha even says as much. He says that there are some things you just avoid.
You just don't, you just avoid.
And one of the things he mentions is actually harmful people. You just stay away.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's all over in the suttas of who you associate and, you know, with and,
Also wild elephants.
Right.
Yeah, I remember at one point walking in Thailand. We went to, when I was in Thailand with Ayasoma and a couple other monks, we went to one of the national forests. And we were walking along the trail and we started hearing this really loud crashing in the underbrush. And one of the monks was like, "Oh, that's probably a wild elephant." And Ayasoma was like, "Then let's turn around and walk away." Like, it's actually, even the Buddha himself said, like, when there's wild elephants, leave, avoid that place. Like, that's not a time to practice patience and equanimity. That's a time to practice get away.
Yeah. Yeah.
So actually, I really appreciate how practical the Buddha was. He was like, wild elephants, avoid. Mosquitoes, tolerate. Elephants, avoid.
Yeah.
Very practical. And this is somewhat related. Bhumika says, what if your thoughts don't match with other person, even if you try to be good to them? You cannot change other people. You can try, but you can't. They have to change themselves. They have to want to change. So actually, I would say that if in situations like that, sometimes the best thing to do, again, is just to avoid contact with that kind of person. If it's not doing you any good and it's not doing them any good, then you just don't have contact with them. And that's the last question related to the topic from online. Anything from the residents here?
Just a sort of amorphous question. I was reflecting when you were talking about intention. Some of the most difficult decisions to make are when one has mixed intentions, which is always right until and so even if it's like an action that wouldn't have like that impact, like not an unwholesome action, but like intentions are mixed, right? So really, any comments on sort of the mixed intentions and discerning what's the heavier intention and trying to be wise about, because some things are really clear. It's kind of mostly good or mostly, but there's some squish in the middle. And that's what I sometimes find really trying to discern, like what's really there and not delude myself. So anything about mixed intentions.
I think first off is starting with clear self-awareness. So like actually really starting with acknowledging like, okay, there's some kind of mixed intention here. And I need to look more closely at this and see why I want to do what I want to do. And then always try to lean it towards the wholesome. What are your thoughts?
Similar, and I just bring it back into the body, particularly with the mixed intentions. I have mixed tensions. And there's a tension somewhere. Usually if I'm like, okay, what does this intention feel like? It's like, oh, okay, what if I soften around that? And usually when I soften, I'll have a more clarity about the right way to move forward. Because I've paused, I've brought it into the body of like, why am I motivated to do that? What does my motivation feel like? And I'm kind of really wanting something from that. I want something. What if I put the wanting part down? Does that still feel?
Thank you. Because it's especially difficult when the action, like ostensibly, is a good action, and it's easy to look at that and sort of lean a little heavier towards, oh, my motives are, so it's usually not with anything like horrible. So.
And we have another question from online that's appeared. Rainbow says, what about when the law makes us do things that are immoral? Well, first off, the law never makes you do anything. You choose to do whatever you do. And when you're faced with a situation where the law seems to be pushing you to do something immoral, well, see if there's another way. So often there's some flexibility. In the United States, actually, there's a lot of exceptions for religious activities in particular, or for religious motivations or intentions. And actually, people often use that as excuses to do what in Buddhism we would classify as immoral behaviors, so unwholesome conduct. But it tends to give leeway for when you have pangs of conscience. So yeah, I would look more closely if you actually feel like the law is generally obligating you to do something immoral. Look more closely to see if there's some way to get around that. Yeah, we always have choices.
I'd agree with we always have choices. I would also really look into what it is. I mean, check, is this immoral? Is this a fixed view I'm holding right now? Or is this really something that the Buddha has said, and when I bring it in and go, wow, if I do that, it's unwholesome. And then if you can really honestly, with clarity, say it's an immoral thing, then what are the consequences of me not doing this immoral thing? What are the consequences of me doing this immoral thing? And you're making a really clear choice then what you really value.
Yeah.
And, and there might be a gentler way that even is within the legal system, as you're saying, to not do that thing. But first and foremost, am I holding a fixed view? Is this actually an immoral thing? Then go through the steps.
Okay. And any last questions from the residents? Yeah, go ahead.
When you have a block of free time and you have different choices you can make, I'm not even sure exactly where this question is going, but I guess just how do you go about feeling out what would be the best use of that time in that moment? And I guess going through mentally priorities, or how do you approach that?
I'd say as long as you're doing something wholesome, you don't need to worry too much about these things.
Is there a concern? I mean, is this free time just completely free and you have all the energy to do whatever you choose to do? Yeah, then don't worry about it. If it's like you've got this block of time and it's free and you actually have a list over here that you're hoping to accomplish, and part of that might actually be some other part of having free time is to nurture, so maybe reading the suttas, or maybe doing some meditation, or maybe taking a nap, or would actually resource you more. So if it's just completely free time and you're resourced to do whatever, if it's like I want to stick something into my free block, notice what seems actually most beneficial. I run into that one a lot.
In monastic life, we often have lots of free time.
Right.
And just do something good with it. Don't worry too much about is this 7.2 good or 7.3 good? Just do it.
Right.
Don't worry too much about these sorts of things. Yeah. And then over time, as you pay attention, then you might start to notice where you need to pay more attention and where you need to focus your efforts more. But just do something wholesome. It doesn't matter that much.
Yes. Sometimes though in monastic life that, got to-do list can get a bit much. At least it's been my experience where I've lived. And so what's ostensibly the free time, I have to actually work with the I should be's. So, yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Okay. Well, maybe that's enough for one evening. Again, just a reminder that tomorrow evening we have Monk Chat. So if I skipped over your question or comment, then you can bring it to Monk Chat tomorrow evening, and we'll have all the random off-topic Dhamma discussions you want to talk about. So for now, we can end the evening with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you tomorrow.